So welcome everyone. We have a presentation today with Stuart Medina Miltimore. He will be presenting for about 20 minutes. We also have co-hosts today, Susan Edels and Darren Quinn, who are both members of Modern Money Australia and will be posing some questions and helping out through Q&A and keeping the conversation going. So first of all, I'll welcome Stuart and give his a brief bio. So Stuart is an economist and he's founder of the Spanish association RedMMT and has contributed to the dissemination of modern monetary theory in Spain by publishing 2 books. I won't attempt the Spanish names, but if you could state the titles of the 2 books, Stuart.
Yes, well, one was called the Leviatán Desencadenado, which is basically about the consequences of the monetary union and providing reasons or a rationale for leaving the monetary union and explaining how that would be done. And the other one is called the People's Currency, which is basically a very brief sort of handbook on MMT for people, an introductory textbook. Was a very short book.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And you also have published regularly with Brave New Europe, which is a very excellent source of information about MMT and the Eurozone. I've been reading a lot of articles off there recently. So welcome, Stuart, and welcome to our hosts, Susan and Darren. Just as a reminder, we will have, after the presentation, we'll have a Q&A. So first we'll have Susan and myself pose a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to attendees to ask questions. If you have a question, you need to put it into the Q&A, so then we know, it doesn't get lost in the chat. If you would like to ask your question live, so audio live, please raise your hand and we'll unmute you. If not, then just we'll have Darren ask that question for you. So just briefly also about MMA, we are a volunteer association and we really have appreciated the donations that have come through with our ticketing system. So thank you to those who have donated. And, we have been able to then pay now for our Zoom subscription for the rest of the year. So it'll enable us to continue with our webinars for the rest of the year. I'd like to now also do an acknowledgement of country, or welcome to country. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I think with that, I'll just also mention briefly that both Darren has been quite active in MMT for a number of years and has a sort of founding or pioneering presence on social media as Oz MMT, and is very passionate about MMT and the policy implications of that and the social justice, economic justice implications of that. And Susan has recently joined Modern Money Australia, thankfully, and she is a very enthusiastic MMT learner, I suppose, still learning, but she's very active and has been her help has been much appreciated. So I'll hand it over to you, Stuart, and then we'll go to questions after your presentation. So I think will you need to share? I think you have the ability.
Yeah, I think I can share my screen here. Okay. Question, I think I have about 20 minutes. Is that how much time I have, more or less?
Yeah, about 20 minutes. Yeah.
About 20 minutes. Okay, so I'll just jump straight to where I want to start because I have a lot of slides, and I'm going to use a smaller number. Hold on a second. I'm struggling here with the scroll now. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about basically the consequences of giving up your monetary sovereignty. In your initial sort of playback, when you were welcoming participants, there's a slogan saying Australia doesn't need to borrow money. Well, that's not the case when you give up your monetary sovereignty. And you can define monetary sovereignty as a situation in which your state, your government issues a currency that is basically non-convertible.
So Stuart, I think you're frozen at the moment.
There we go. Okay, I apologize for that. I don't know what happened, but I lost the internet connection or Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah.
I have to be, since it's early in the morning on a Saturday morning, I have to be in another room in my house. So I might let my family sleep. And I think my Wi-Fi connection is not as good here. So sorry about that. So where did we lose connection?
I think it was soon after you were talking about, it was very soon after your opening statements.
Yeah.
That people who have the countries that have given up monetary sovereignty are required to borrow.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry about that. So any case, I hope we can see my screen now, which is, I think, when I lost the connection. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think you guys are going to have a conversation with Fadel Kaboub in a few days, and he will be talking, I'm sure, about the spectrum of monetary sovereignties. And you can consider, a situation where you give up your currency completely, such as countries like Ecuador gave up their currency some years ago and now use the US dollar. Or countries like the Eurozone countries, which basically relinquished their monetary sovereignty and entered a currency union. And there you have situations that range from those of the former colonies of France and Africa, which used the CFA franc. So they're part of a monetary union. And the Eurozone countries likewise have given up their monetary sovereignty. The difference being that Eurozone countries have a seat at the central bank, whereas those CFA franc countries do not have a seat at the central bank. Now, of course, this has consequences for those countries. And I think I'd like a nice way to, if I can move on, a nice way to look at it is this sort of diagram, which I think initially Eric Timoine shared online. And if you ask the questions, is the economy at full employment? And does the government exercise monetary sovereignty? You can sort of arrive at this schematic, right, in which a country that enjoys full monetary sovereignty, or rather exercises this monetary sovereignty, because that's not something that falls from the sky. It's a decision. It's a political decision whether you exercise your monetary sovereignty or not. Well, that country's government would only be limited by the availability of real resources, and not face any sort of financial constraints. So that country would not need to borrow money or would not need to raise taxes before it spends. The only limitation to its spending would be the number of unemployed people, etc. In case that country does reach a level of full employment, which is rarely achieved ever anyhow, I've never seen such a situation, then you would face a real constraint. Otherwise, you would face absolutely.
I think we've lost you again, Stuart.
About that, yeah, I must be having an unstable connection. Okay, yeah. So in the case of Spain, as a member of the Eurozone country, we gave up our monetary sovereignty in 1999, but in reality, we had given up that monetary sovereignty years before when we joined the European Economic Communities, and basically had to manage our currency exchange rate with other European, especially the German mark and French franc and other European currencies, within a narrow band. And that exchange rate management has forced the country basically to limit its scope for monetary policy and fiscal policy in many ways. I'm not going to go into details of how that affected the economy in the 1990s and in 2000s. We joined the euro in 1999, and that was soon followed by a real estate bubble, which is a massive real estate bubble, probably credit driven, obviously created by banks. It caused the economy to go through a period of very high growth. And that's why, in a sense, for most Spaniards, I think the entry into the Eurozone was associated with a period of relative economic prosperity. But as any bubbles, or with all bubbles, eventually pop and burst, and it left a legacy of huge unemployment and a bank bailout, which caused Spain to request assistance from its European partners through a huge loan, which came with conditions and effectively put Spain under the control of what we call the men in black, right? People who come from the Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, who imposed a harsh regime of austerity. And as a consequence of that harsh regime of austerity, not as bad as Greece, but pretty bad, Spain has undergone a period of almost a decade of low public investment, which has, I think, undermined the public infrastructure. And specifically, I would say the health system was particularly hit by this set of austerity policy. So when the pandemic arrived last year, I think we were not ready as a country. And there's several indicators that was the case. For example, the number of ICU, intensive care unit beds in Spain was about half of what you see in Germany and about a third of the number of ICU beds that they had in South Korea. So our health system had been, was poorly equipped to face and manage a pandemic situation. And that's what led to the frantic response that we initiated in March last year, when the pandemic started to spread, and we suddenly realized that we didn't have enough hospital beds to cope with it, and since had to put the country under a severe lockdown. I'm going to jump. I have many slides here, but I'm going to jump to, if I can get out of here. There we go. I'm going to jump ahead, and I'm going to go to some slides that show you how the Eurozone, and specifically Spain, has managed during the pandemic and the COVID crisis. And this one was a chart from, I think, the Financial Times, if I remember correctly. And it has two axes. One is the decline in GDP experienced in the first half of 2020. And that's the y-axis. And the x-axis shows the cumulative number of deaths per million. And if you look at the down, the quadrant in the down right-hand side, you can see that there's a few countries there, like the UK, Spain, and Italy. The UK is not a member of the Eurozone, but it has certainly been applying neoliberal policies and has been certainly undermining the National Health Service for many years. And I think it was also poorly equipped to respond to the pandemic as a consequence. But also countries like Italy and Spain have had enormous declines in GDP, and as well as some of the highest death rates in the world as a consequence of COVID. Some statistics came out last week and it's the National Institute of Statistics estimates that there's 92,000 excess deaths from what would normally occur in a normal year as a consequence of COVID-19. And the question is, well, why has this happened? And when we compare with what other countries like New Zealand and Australia have done, and other countries in Southeast Asia have done, they have decided to apply strict lockdowns and exterminate the virus, essentially. And this is a big difference because obviously they have arrested the spread of the virus very effectively. And we applied a very strict lockdown during the first few months of from March to April last year. And that was quite effective, in fact. And we could see a rapid decline in number of infections and the number of deaths, etc. But the problem was that we have an economy that depends a lot on the tourism sector. And the pressure to open up and let the German tourists or French tourists flock into the country was too great, especially because there was very little income or not enough income support for owners of the the tourism, entertainment sort of sectors to face a long shutdown. So the economic losses were enormous for a lot of these people, and there was nothing to compensate them, or not enough to compensate. The government basically limited its support role to providing assistance to companies who are putting their employees in furlough, and virtually nothing else other than loans and bank guarantees for business owners. In general, the management of the pandemic in Europe has been pathetic or atrocious. We're now going through vaccination, and interestingly, the European Union negotiated a contract with some of the larger manufacturers of vaccines. The contract was negotiated by Ursula von der Leyen, who seems to be fairly incompetent, and her approach was to get the best deal possible, in other words, the best price. And the consequence is that these large multinational pharmaceutical corporations, which are not non-profit organizations, have given priority to countries who paid a higher price and reached agreements earlier and had approved the vaccine earlier as well. So the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, was slow in approving the drug. And also, the European Union negotiated a much lower price. So of course, companies like AstraZeneca have been sending or shipping, the vaccine to countries like the United States. The UK has, I think, about already 40% of the population vaccinated. Countries like Morocco, who are not southern neighbors outside of the Eurozone, outside of the European Union, presumed to be an underdeveloped country, have already vaccinated a much larger number of people than, or percentage of their population than Spain has. Chile, for example, has a very high percentage of people vaccinated as well. So bad management in general in the European Union. Let me see. So as I said, the response of the Spanish government in terms of fiscal impulse, meaning actual transfers to the population, to the people who were suffering the consequences of the pandemic, has been very conservative and really constrained by the austerity bias that imprints the whole Eurozone, and especially countries who are in a weaker financial position. In other words, countries who have a large government debt and who basically rely on the European Central Bank buying their debt in the secondary market, so that the bond vigilantes do not basically force you to start spending, cut spending, and or raising taxes, right? So introducing deflationary pressures and austerity measures, or preemptive austerity. And the government in Spain has basically been acting with a mentality of preemptive austerity. And even though the Eurozone has suspended the fiscal rules, which require governments to have less than 0.5% of a structural balance as a percentage of GDP. And I don't know how familiar people are with the concept of a structural balance, but a structural balance is the fiscal balance that you would have in a situation of full employment. So saying that you have to have a structural balance of less than 0.5% is basically saying that you almost have to have a 0% balance, which means basically liquidating people's savings and you're trying to liquidate basically all the government debt. So it's a crazy policy, and it imprints this permanent austerity bias, as I said. Now, of course, I think I'm going to go through this one. This is the sector balances analysis of the Spanish economy. I noticed that you have one in your logo in the Australian Association. And of course, the Eurozone, of course, might pretend that it is possible to eliminate all government borrowing. Of course, it's impossible unless you want to cause the economy to crash. And Spain has, and most European countries, except the net exporters, haven't been in compliance with those targets for many, many years, right? And this is what the sectoral balances approach shows. But take a look at the data for the second quarter of 2020, where you see the consequences of the lockdown. And there was an important fiscal impulse in Spain. But then look at the third quarter and see how the impulse or the fiscal support of the Spanish economy almost completely disappeared in the third quarter. And that is quite telling of a mentality of the finance minister and the economy ministers, who are basically obsessed with sustaining a balanced budget at all costs, even if it costs the complete collapse of the economy. And you can see it also in treasury operations. If you look at the net debt of the Spanish treasury, we see that there was an initial rise in net debt in Spain during the first 2 quarters of the year until June, basically last year. But then it basically remains flat for the rest of the year. There's a little uptick in February 2021, but basically the government just decided to withdraw the support of the economy after the third quarter of 2020. And even so, even despite the fact that the European Central Bank has offered to buy European treasuries up to a limit of 1.5 trillion euros, which is unprecedented, of course, and could have been used by the Spanish government to issue a lot more debt. But the austerity mentality prevails in the end. And the consequence, of course, for the Spanish economy has been disastrous. So I was mentioned that the government has yielded to pressure from the tourist and hospitality sectors to open up. We've been hearing the same message each time there was a holiday season approaching. We have to save Christmas. We need to save the summer. Now there's talk of maybe we need to save the Easter holidays. We haven't saved the hospitality sector in any event. This is some data of GDP growth last year, or rather degrowth last year per provinces. And you see the burgundy colors are the tourist areas, places like the Canary Islands, Balearic Islands, Girona, the Costa Brava, and the Costa del Sol, so the southern, basically the Mediterranean axis. The numbers are hard to see. This is not my graph, but if you look at maybe you can see that in the Balearic Islands, the collapse in GDP was 27% last year. And in the Canary Islands, it was in excess of 20%. And in some of the Mediterranean provinces, it was also close to 20%. So much higher downfalls in GDP than in industrial areas like the Basque Country, where the collapse was, or the decline was only about 9%. But in total country, the country as a total had a decline of 11% in GDP. So in the end, I think you can't have your cake and eat it at the same time. You have to decide what you want to do. If you want to open up the economy like Brazil has done, or the UK did initially, or the US under Trump has done, thinking that you're going to be able to do something about, or at least protecting some degree of growth in the economy, I think you're not going to be successful. The evidence points out to the fact that countries that didn't act decisively against the virus on the excuse that they were prioritizing the economy over the health of people have found that their declines in GDP have been in fact larger than those of countries that actually decided to protect their populations from the virus. So bad management, huge economic crisis. And what we were seeing around May, June, also an ineffective response from the European Union, who seemed completely incapable of coordinating any sort of response amongst the European countries. And we saw situations in which countries closed their borders without communicating anything to the European Commission. Sorry about that. And things like stockpiles of masks and so forth. Being built up in some countries and not sharing those masks or medicines with other countries that were more affected by the pandemic. So you would start to see a rise in Euroscepticism in public opinion in Spain and Italy, especially in Italy, but also, interestingly enough, in Spain, a country which had traditionally been very staunchly pro-European. I think that's what led to a decision in July last year to approve a rescue package or a bailout package, which is called Next Generation EU. And it was a process that raised a lot of acrimony amongst European countries at the time. The Northern European countries, such as the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, even Germany, although Germany was a lot more quiet. The countries that were more vocal were probably the Netherlands and Austria. Did not want to come to any sort of arrangement that would imply any transfer of financial resources from the Northern European countries to the badly hit Mediterranean economies that rely on tourism. But there was a proposal coming out of the European Commission, and it was strongly supported by the Italian government, the Spanish government, and to a certain extent the French government, to set up an extraordinary fund that would transfer some resources to those badly hit economies in the south of Europe. There was even a recording of a Dutch citizen asking the Dutch Prime Minister to not provide any or not send any money to those southern Europeans. And there was substantial acrimoning the Spanish press against the Dutch for being, unsolidary, not showing the solidarity to the Southern European countries. But in the end, an agreement was reached in July, and Pedro Sanchez, the prime minister, was welcomed back in his residence with this. I'm just going to show you this short video recording here by his staff and some of the ministers when he came back from that meeting in the Council of Europe that approved this package, as if it were some kind of hero returning from battle, right? So this next generation EU package is basically a combination of grants, guarantees, and loans for a total of 750 billion euros, right? And this has been heralded as a sort of a Hamiltonian moment of the Eurozone, because it was presented as an unprecedented decision and a precedented package to rescue and kickstart the economy. The problem is that 700 billion might look like a large number, but when you put it in relationship to the size of the European Union's economy, it's less than 3% of GDP. And moreover, the amounts are not going to be dispersed in 2021, only a small fraction. But the economic crisis that started in 2020, most of the funds will be dispersed between 2021 and 2026. This is an estimate from a think tank called Bruegel, which is based in Brussels and does research on European issues or European Union issues. And we see that the money is coming in too late. So it's too little, too late. The other thing is that some programs were just a rehash of old existing or pre-existing programs. For example, Horizon Europe has been around for several years, so they're just reclassifying programs that were already in existence as next generation EU programs, and only 374 is actually real loans. So in total, the net, the transfers to the European economies from next generation EU is a pitiful amount of money, especially when you distribute it across several years. Now, of course, the program was presented in the Spanish press as a success. It is true that Spain and Italy are getting the larger amounts compared to other countries, not as a proportion of their economy. Some southeastern European countries are getting larger percentages in comparison to the size of their economy. But what you see in the press in Spain is that Spain, for example, this is an example of one headline in a Spanish newspaper saying, well, we're going to get 140 billion euros from the European Union. And it's, of course, sounds like a large number, but when you got to analyze it in detail, well, it turns out it's only 57 billion in transfers from the European Union. The rest is loans, which apparently the government is a bit hesitant to take on because of the potential conditionality that would be associated to those loans. And when you distribute it through time, as in the previous chart, most of the money will be coming in the years after 2021. In fact, I was looking at the general budget of the Spanish government, and that orange bar just shows how much money we'll be getting in net transfers once you look at the contribution of Spain to the European Union budget and the money that we'll be getting back from the European Union. It turns out that we are only getting about 5.7 billion euros, which is less than 0.5% of our GDP. So again, too little, too late. It's not going to be effective, or it's not a stimulus of sufficient size to really get the economy growing again. And there are other issues. the way the program is funded is that the European Commission will be allowed to issue debt in the markets starting this year. And then that money will be paid back in installments after 2027. Now, the thing is, who's going to pay for that? And you would think, well, when the European Commission pays back its debt, of course, its budget is distributed amongst a member state in according to certain rules. Basically, countries contribute to the European Union budget based on several factors. The most important resources are based on the gross national income of the countries and also the VAT, the value-added tax base. So countries contribute according to their share of national gross income of the European Union and also their share of their value-added tax. There are other resources such as customs collections and so forth. And that will be the key to this, the key that will be used in the distribution of the EU budget amongst the European Union member states. Now, it just so happens that this year the UK has left the European Union, and the UK was a net contributor to the European Union, and I was interested in seeing how that affected the distribution of the EU budget amongst European Union nations. This is not information that is publicly available, so I had to do some number crunching with what I knew about the European Union budget. So I use estimates of the gross national income, and I used some estimation of what the value-added tax base would be for all the European country or European Union countries next year, and also had to consider that several European Union countries, namely Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, Finland, Denmark, had negotiated rebates on their contribution to the European Union budget. And what I found is that in general, it seems like the countries of Northern Europe who have been not as badly hit as the Southern European nations are not seeing an increase in their significant or much higher increase in their contribution to the European Union budget. It's the Eastern European countries in Ireland who are going to be paying for the departure of the United Kingdom and the loss of their net contribution to the European Union budget. So what we're seeing is, in reality, far from seeing solidarity from northern, more advanced economies from Northern Central Europe, what we're seeing is actually the peripheral countries that are paying for those costs. We don't know how the loans or the debt that the European Commission is taking on will be distributed, because it depends on what the gross national income of those European countries will be in 2027. So you would have to make some sort of estimate of what it will be in 2027, what our gross national income will be then. But the conclusion is that basically we're taking a loan that we will be paying back in the future. We're not receiving a net transfer of funds from Northern Europe. And in fact, I did this little chart here, and I actually came to the conclusion that the distribution of the European Union budget is actually regressive. Here we have GDP per capita on the y-axis and the percentage of each country's contribution to the European Union budget as a percentage of their gross national income. So each dot represents a country and a combination of those two variables. And what we see is here is a negative slope. In other words, the lower your country's GDP per capita, the higher your country's contribution to the European Union's general budget is. So it's clearly a regressive arrangement that is benefiting Northern European countries who also happen to have a trade surplus within the European Union trading bloc. But there are other issues as well with the next generation EU. here's a headline from a newspaper where Pablo Iglesias, the leader of the Podemos, which was this sort of populist progressive party that was founded about 5-7 years ago and caused a lot of concern amongst European elites. It was seen as the new European Syriza. Eventually, they entered into a coalition with the socialist, sort of neoliberal socialist party as a junior partner. And here Iglesias, their leader, is saying, well, this is great news because these funds are going to be coming, this inflow, this huge inflow of 140 billion, which we have seen this not as large as the press is trying to make us believe. It's going to come without conditions. Well, when you read some of the documentation coming out of the European Commission, this was something that came out a few weeks ago, and I was reading through it, and you could find some phrases which I think are cause for concern. For example, the European Commission is asking European countries to submit reform programs if they want to receive this money. And the reforms, examples of these reforms could include pension reforms, labor market reforms, education and training reforms, etc. It's strengthening basically active labor market policies, which is the conventional mainstream response to the unemployment problem. So what we're going to see is, again, so-called structural reform, which is basically a shorthand for neoliberal reforms in Spain, and also reforms which might bring budgetary savings. So again, what we're going to see is probably austerity as soon as the pandemic is over. And there's also serious questions about the governance of these funds, because it's very worrying to see that large consulting firms, first of all, have clearly influenced on how the decree governing the distribution of funds. I was reading this decree a few weeks ago, and the first few articles, you could just see consultant jargon all over it, from Article 1 to Article 57. Doesn't matter which article you read through, it was clearly drafted by one of these large consulting firms. And a huge proportion of the money is going to go to these strategic projects for recovery and transformation, meaning private-public partnerships. So in the end, the conclusion I reached is, well, why did the Spanish government enter in this, or push for this sort of agreement with the European Union? Because clearly it was Pedro Sanchez and Conte, the former Italian prime minister, who were more interested in getting these funds approved. Clearly, we're not getting net transfers of funds from other European countries. We're just lending the money to ourselves. And it's just we're just advancing money that we'll pay back in the future. We could have just issued debt in the market anyhow and let the central bank buy it. And the only conclusion I get to is, well, number one, I think the European Union needed some kind of PR, some kind of PR stunt that would sort of reverse the growing Euroscepticism in countries like Spain and Italy. And I think they have been successful because the press have been very enthusiastic about the funds. And secondly, I think it was a way of getting out of the general budget a large chunk of money, which the government could use to distribute as it saw fit, without the interference of its junior cabinet members, the populist, crazy ministers from Podemos, which are uncomfortable, who are demanding all these progressive reforms and reversal of the neoliberal labor market regulations that have, for example, had restricted collective wage bargaining as at the behest of the European Central Bank a few years ago. I think in the end, this was a tool designed for those two purposes, rescuing not the Spanish economy. It was about rescuing the European Union's deteriorating image, and also providing the Spanish government with a tool to counteract the populist, uncomfortable ministers in the cabinet. That's the only conclusion I can reach. And it's not going to be effective in restoring growth anytime soon. So what we're seeing now is an economy that went through a huge economic crisis after the global financial crisis, probably one of the biggest crises amongst developed nations. After 2009, we saw a massive rise of unemployment. The unemployment level reached in Spain 27% around 2011. There's a chart there, I just didn't show it because I had too many slides. And we have about 40% youth unemployment in Spain. And this has been going on for over a decade now. We were beginning to get out of the last crisis around 2017. We finally reached the GDP level that we had in 2008. So almost a decade later. But we still had over 15% unemployment at the end of 2019. This has come in and has, given the Spanish economy another blow. We're now above 16% unemployment in Spain. The worst, I think, is this rise of the precariat in Spain. We have, when you look at, for example, these are statistics from the Ministry of Labor, and you see that 9 out of every 10 contracts is basically a temporary contract. And of course, most young people in Spain have never experienced a permanent job in their lifetime. And hence what we're seeing is consequences in terms of, households new households not being created, birth rates collapsing. There's this title, which I saw a few weeks ago, 70% of women older than 35 do not have children. And of course, fertility rates drops dramatically after the age of 35. So if those women do want to have children, basically they have to give up, having children. We're seeing that the number of deaths during the first half of 2020 exceeded the number of births by almost 100,000, 94,000. It's only foreign immigration that is compensating the loss of population. And even more worrying or cause of serious concern is how this is affecting the mental health of the Spanish population, and especially youth. Headlines there saying that, for example, the article on the left says that the mental health of the Spanish population plummets during the pandemic and there's no network. Or the news piece on the right says that, especially young people felt very depressed and felt that life had no sense as a consequence of the pandemic. It's basically because their projects, their livelihoods are being put on hold, and there's really nothing for them. There's just basically no work, and no, there's just no opportunity to access to homes, to buying a house, or to getting married, to having children. In other words, there's simply not one, but 2 generations in Spain now that have basically been lost. And this is basically the message that I wanted to transmit. What the main implication of giving up your currency, your monetary sovereignty, is that you basically render your government incapable of providing a response to a crisis situation such as the pandemic that we're living through right now. So I'll leave it there because I suspect I might have overextended the 20-minute time that you initially indicated. So
thank you.
Open for questions.
Yeah. Well, I just feel it's horrifying to see how you've illustrated the impact, not only of coronavirus, but of the decades prior of, the the Eurozone, the impact of the neoliberal project, basically. And it just wanted to say it is almost like you're being held hostage by a bunch of neoliberal psychopaths, and you have leaders that are suffering from Stockholm syndrome. They're just, ingratiating to the elites, aren't they? And not really showing genuine leadership to their citizens and protecting their citizens, and it's horrifying.
We're being held ransom with our own money.
Yeah.
In other words, that's the conclusion I arrive at. So,
and there will be some questions. I think Susan was going to ask some questions about the sort of technicalities of the bond market and what the ECB is doing with PEP programs.
Yeah, I had an even longer presentation. I don't know what I was thinking when I started putting slides in there, and then realized that I probably had too many in there. And I was going to address the ECB purchase programs, the quantitative easing. Now, what happens? You might, I don't know if you've been following European affairs for the last few years, especially after the crisis, but in 2010, when the European crisis was putting at risk the whole survival of the Eurozone project, and countries like Italy or Spain or Greece were experiencing an increase in the yields of their treasuries in their secondary markets, because the markets correctly, I think, were prognosticating the risk of default of those countries, because they did not have a central bank that would acquire or support their debt like most monetary sovereigns do. In fact, ironically, central banks were initially set up to provide funding for the governments. That was the oldest central bank, I think, is the Bank of England, the Bank of Sweden. The Bank of Spain also dates back to the 18th century. And their initial role was to provide funding to governments, especially so that they could conduct war. Of course, that was the reason why the Bank of England was set up, is so that the government could afford to go to war. 18th century was a period of almost permanent warfare amongst European powers. But ironically, when the European Monetary Union was set up, the central bank was not allowed to purchase or fund the governments in any way. I say central banks because in actuality, we think there's a single central bank. The truth is that all the national central banks are still there. And even though we still have a central bank, our central bank was not allowed to buy the bonds or the treasuries issued by the Spanish treasury. So, of course, when 2009, the global financial crisis hits, bondholders start demanding higher yields, because they realize that countries like Spain, which did not have very, very large debt, actually, our debt was about 30% of GDP at the time, but the bondholders realized that we would have to bail out our banking system because of the collapse of the real estate bubble, and hence the increase in defaults, et cetera. And in fact, the banks had to be bailed out and were bailed out, especially the savings and loans institutions, the cajas de ahorros.
And bailed out by the ECB.
Bailed out by the Spanish government with a loan from not the ECB, but from outside the ECB, outside the European Union, in fact, by a special agreement or facility that was set up by members of the Eurozone. Because some countries did not want to bail out other countries' banks. Mm-hmm. And Trichet, at the time, the governor of the president of the European Central Bank, sent a letter to the prime ministers of Spain and Italy. And the letter basically demanded that Spain implement a series of structural reforms. Otherwise, they would not provide support for this for the Spanish issuances. And the letter basically demanded that the Spanish government, get rid of collective bargaining clauses and other. It's actually publicly available. You can actually find the letter in internet. And moreover, not only did the government, the Spanish government, comply with those demands, also the golden rule, sort of the balanced budget amendment, was introduced in the Spanish Constitution almost overnight, in less than a month, with no public debate, no referendum, no serious discussion of the consequences. So now we have enshrined in our Constitution that we have to reach basically a 0.4 structural balance, meaning the balance that you would have under full employment. Since Spain is never in full employment, of course, we'll never reach that structural balance. But there was a time when, 2010, 2011, when the Survive the Euro project was in question. And there was actual concern that Spain might have to default on its obligations to its bondholders. And then Trichet finally was left the presidency of the European Central Bank, and Draghi was named as his successor. Draghi is a bit smarter than Trichet and not as dogmatic as Trichet. And Draghi started the program of purchases of government debt from the Southern European countries, and then the quantitative easing program in 2013. It first had to go through the hurdle of the European Court of Justice, which sort of overlooked the explicit prohibition in the European treaties, because in the European treaties, it says that the central banks will not fund the governments, and that means either directly or indirectly, if you interpret it correctly. But in response to a consultation from the German Constitutional Court, the European Court of Justice authorized these purchases. And well, of course, what these purchases do is that now the Spanish government can issue debt, and it knows at least a fraction of that debt will be acquired by the Bank of Spain, actually, because it's not the central bank that buys the national debt. It's each national bank that buys the treasuries of its own country. So right now, about 27% of Spain's government debt is owned by the Bank of Spain. There was a proposal by Piquet, the French economist, a few weeks ago, proposing to cancel all the debt in the balance sheet of the central banks. I think it's a pointless proposal. I think, you can do it. You could just strike it out of the books and leave it at zero, right? And nothing would happen. The ground would not shake. But the issue here,
question actually that she wanted to ask about canceling. What did you think of canceling the debt?
Well, I think it would nothing would happen. It would be great. It would just sort of relieve some pressure in terms of the ratios that we have to meet within the Maastricht Treaty rules. But the main issue is the Stability and Growth Pact, which limits the first of all the amount of spending as a percentage, or the deficit as a percentage of GDP, but also the growth in spending from year to year. It has to be less than the midterm growth potential of the Spanish economy. So basically imprinting a permanent austerity bias in spending and fiscal deficits. So even though now the European Central Bank is supporting our debt in the secondary market, they can't buy the government debt directly from the Spanish government. That is not legal, but they can buy it from banks who buy it in auctions. In the sort of the auction where the debt goes into the market.
It's just such a it's just absurd theater, really, isn't it? They've just trapped you. It's all these technical just to depoliticize and remove all sovereignty, really. And
that's what it's about.
Yeah. And
that's what it's about, because basically now the general budget you have to send a draft to the technocrats in Brussels for pre-approval of the budget. That the question is then what do you need a parliament for? Why don't you just shut down the parliament? I mean, if there's no point in having a parliament if the budget has to be pre-approved by a technocrat in Brussels.
They are just puppets in. Yeah.
Exactly. So the word is, and that's what Next Generation EU is about. It's about depoliticizing at least a chunk of the budget. Doesn't have to go through the parliament anymore. It just, there's a committee in the government that, decides where the money's going to. And the rules are set by the European Commission. So a bunch of technocrats saying, oh, well, you can use money for these types of projects, but not for this other type of projects. And moreover, a condition on doing certain structural reforms of the economy, right?
Susan, would you like to ask a question? I've seen you unmuted.
Yes, well, first of all, let me say I'm coming to you from Banjalan country, and so I acknowledge the ownership of that land. But yes, I hadn't understood fully your objection to Piketty and those economists, because I thought if the ECB was buying the debt, that would allow Spain a bit of room to spend money on the population. But that's, tell me.
No, I mean, the point is, I think I understand where he's coming from, but I think he doesn't understand that, basically when the ECB buys debt in the secondary marketing, it's just exchanging one type of asset for another asset. It's just an exchange of assets. So basically what they're doing is changing the composition of the balance sheet of the banks. But the net financial position of the government vis-a-vis the private sector doesn't change at all. It stays the same. Whether the Bank of Spain writes it off or it doesn't write off, the net financial position of the private sector will be exactly the same. And of course, it might be helpful in the sense that, yes, you have maybe a lower percentage of debt to GDP. So that ratio might improve a bit in terms of the Maastricht Treaty rules. But what's wrong really is the Maastricht Treaty rules in the first place.
Yes.
It's the fact that you have a 60% debt to GDP limit according to the Maastricht rules. That's the real issue. If you don't reform the Stability and Growth Pact, all you will achieve is a change in composition of portfolios, but little else. The main issue here is giving the Spanish government and the European governments enough leeway to increase spending when it's needed and increase discretionary spending beyond what automatic stabilizers do. Currently, what the government in Spain is doing is just letting automatic stabilizers act, and that's about it. And very little stimulus besides that. And the main reason is that because you have all these rules that you have to comply with, and of course the neoliberal framework, which is also inside their heads and inside the heads of the Minister of Finance, right? I mean, even if she suddenly were released from complying with all these crazy rules, he will still be, trying to achieve a balanced budget, because that's the way she, even if we were out of the Eurozone, it's like the UK. UK is out of the Eurozone. It's never been a member of the Eurozone. But nevertheless, they have been applying neoliberal policies all along, and they've been applied draconian austerity for years, and the consequences that the NHS wasn't able to cope with the pandemic either. So having monetary sovereignty is a precondition, is a necessary condition for having a government that applies successful progressive policies and counter-cyclical policy, but it's not sufficient. You need to abandon the neoliberal mind frame as well. the neoliberal framework.
Yeah, I was had a conversation with Darren earlier today, and I said the MMT lens, you know, once you just can't unsee the injustices in the world. You look at everything through that lens, and every policy you can see how they're going wrong and the consequences of that policy. I mean, pretty much it does drive you slightly crazy, and you spend a lot of time being very angry because, you know, at the end of those policies are people who are not being done right by their government. Their, you know, their lives are being, you know, affected in a negative way, a very negative way. And I mean, particularly during COVID, obviously, there's been really disastrous consequences for the neoliberal approach. And yeah, it is like you're seeing, it sort of reminds me of the Sixth Sense movie where you see dead people. It's like the MMT lens. That's very morbid, but it's, yeah, you can't unsee all of these awful consequences that could be so different. And you know, you just want to have the new, what's possible. You just want what's possible now to happen now. It's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cultural war or a cultural battle because, I mean, the thing is, yes, we are aware as MMTers that our governments could do better, but we're just on the fringe, unfortunately. And when you read the press, you listen to mainstream economists, they're still thinking in terms of the gold standard era. They don't realize the potential for the of a fiat currency issuer and the capacity it has to spend as needed and as long as there's available resources. But it's even worse in countries who had decided to move into a new sort of gold standard, such as the euro, because in effect, the euro is like a new gold standard for countries in Southern Europe. And they moved into it voluntarily. And I think they were also perfectly aware of what they were doing. I think the Spanish elites, at least those who had some understanding of economics, there's a speech by Malo de Molina, who was the head of research of the Bank of Spain in 1999. And there he acknowledges that, you know, well, this is an experiment. For the first time, you have a monetary union. Well, he was forgetting that it wasn't the first time because he didn't remember that there was the African monetary unions, the Central African and the Northwest African monetary unions, which were a good precedent, and they could have looked at those and see the consequences for the development of those countries. And probably behind the underdevelopment of a lot of Africa is the fact that they don't have monetary sovereignty. But he was perfectly aware it was the first time there were, in his words, that there was going to be a monetary union without a fiscal union. And he, in his speech in 1999, he said, well, we better have, you know, a balanced budget, and we'll better be ready because we're not going to be able to use fiscal policy as a counter-cyclical tool. But he was actually in favor of entering the Eurozone because he, you know, people like him and other economists thought that the fiscal discipline that it would impose on the Eurozone members would be good for the economy. It would force countries to do structural reforms that would make them competitive. And, you know, they're thinking in terms of export-led growth models, or in other words, mercantilist models, where you have and they're thinking in terms of the binding or the restrictions that, or the constraints that a gold standard creates on the governments. And that's basically what they were thinking about. And they just went head in, you know, even though the Eurozone did not meet the criteria for an optimal currency area, according to Mundell, who was this economist who was investigating how, you know, what conditions should be met by countries that join a monetary union. And clearly the Eurozone was not an optimal currency area. Like Australia, we could consider Australia as an optimal currency area because, you know, you have perfect, or at least nearly perfect mobility of capital and workers. You know, if the economy is not good in Sydney, you can always move on to Melbourne if there's jobs there. Australia, all the provinces or states in Australia, their economies more or less move in synchrony, so it means you can use the same set of fiscal policies or monetary policies. And well, those conditions were not obviously you know, and you also have a federal capacity, a federal government which transfers funds to areas which are going through a recession or a decline versus the rest of the country. So those are the three conditions that Mundell described as an optimal currency area. Clearly, the Eurozone is not an optimal currency area. However, Mundell was in favor of the Eurozone project because he thought the discipline would be good for the yeah, so Darian is disputing that as a rural Australian, and I would agree with you probably. Maybe Australia is not an optimal currency area, or maybe the government is not, exercising its fiscal capacity the way it should. But it could. It just doesn't. But it could. Or Hayek who was one of the founders of Montpellier Society and one of the minds behind the neoliberal movement of which began in the 1940s after the Second World War. Hayek was an enthusiast of the European Union because he thought that under the discipline of the European Union, and also because if in the European Union, and we've seen this during the negotiations for the establishment of this Next Generation EU fund, you don't have a demos, you don't have people in the Netherlands do not feel that the Spaniards are their compatriots or Greeks are not their compatriots. So the willingness to transfer funds, to see their government transferring funds to those countries is much less. So hence, countries that experience a downturn have to adjust basically by, as we have done in the last few years, basically by a process called internal evaluation. Since you can't devalue your currency, the way you adjust is by lowering wages, which is what Spain did in the last 10 years, is basically forcing wages down to restore competitiveness. Of course, the problem is that not all countries can be net exporters at the same time. But I have to say that if you saw the sectoral balances chart or graph that I show you, actually Spain has now, for several years, had a current account surplus after having a deficit for many years. And it's more because it's more due to the fact that the internal demand has been depressed for many years, and hence imports have not grown as much as exports, rather than actually having a very competitive economy. But that was the strategy that the European Commission proposed for Spain.
Is that something that's celebrated as the turning as a good student of neoliberalism they're doing?
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I mean, of course, by mainstreams it would be celebrated. From our point of view, from our MMT lens, it means that our living standards, our real living standards, have declined, and as a matter of fact, they have. And you can tell. We don't have the same purchasing power that we had 10 years ago with the real estate bubble. Right? Well, actually, that was 12 years ago now. So, in the real estate bubble, during those crazy years of this credit-fueled expansion, people were dropping out of school because there were good jobs in the construction industry. And people who never finished school just went on to lay bricks. Because it was jobs. Were paying good salaries in construction. Once the crisis hit, they lost their jobs, and many of these people never got a job back, or just started getting, temporary contracts or working intermittently. A lot of people have been struggling since 2009 in this country with,
Yeah, it seems I can't imagine being a young person with that such high unemployment levels, that sense of hopelessness. I mean, other opportunities wouldn't exist either and why, study and all of those things.
Yeah.
So looking
Well,
forward to something in your life.
That's what gave rise to the this Occupy movement in 2011 in Madrid and other cities in Spain, where youth camped in the main squares and for weeks, and eventually originated this Podemos party, which was a surprise and caught the system off guard, and they suddenly got a 20-some% share of the total vote in the elections in 2015, I think it was. And suddenly the elites panicked in Spain and in Europe. They panicked because they thought, oh, this is another Syriza, right? Like, as in Greece. And they were going to almost on the verge of overcoming the Socialist Party, which has a traditional neoliberal social democratic party like the Labour Party today, right? The third way sort of social democracy, third way Labour, right? Third way social democracy. And it forced the European Union to sort of let go a bit on the fiscal discipline, on the application of fiscal discipline, sort of turn a blind eye to the Spanish government's permanent deficits and lack of compliance with the fiscal rules for a few years. And after 2013, the economy started to grow again, and we started to see some good growth rates between 2013 and 2018. It started to slow down in 2019, and then the 2020 pandemic hit us again. But it was because of a panic. And now the problem is that Podemos, I think, has undermined its own project by entering into this coalition with the current government, with the socialists, because basically they do not control the agenda. They don't control economic policy. And hence they're going to be associated with the legacy of the crisis. And interestingly enough, because the political system is in disarray, and the conservative are in a mess right now, the Socialist Party is actually doing well in the polls. And it shows you how effective it is to use a PR stunt as Next Generation EU. I mean, people honestly believe in Spain that the government has brought 140 billion euros from Europe, and that it's a lot of money, and it's in the headlines. And people really believe that this is going to kickstart the economy, and it's just going to be this billions raining on Spain for several years. I think they're going to be in for a disappointment, but they still don't. I think that they're still not aware. I think public opinion is still not aware of what Next Generation EU is really about. It's not as much money as they say, and it's not enough. It's not enough, and it's not soon enough. I mean, it's just not even. They haven't started to spend a cent yet, and from this program in Spain, nothing. And we have this depression, economic depression, basically, and nothing is happening. Absolutely nothing is happening.
So I might, we've got some questions in the Q&A, and actually, so Darren, did you, just a reminder to people, if they wanted to ask live, to put your hand up, and we can unmute you and you can ask the question live, but otherwise Darren will ask the questions for you. So Wayne, you have a few questions there. Go, Darren.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Stuart, for a wonderful presentation. I won't go over some of it again, because I just read your article on RedMMT, which this presentation was based on. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from Wiradjuri country. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respect to the past, present, and emerging elders of this traditional land. I might just get in my question first, then we'll ask Wayne if he wants to ask one of his questions. I've managed to narrow my question down to a two-parter, basically. It was much more long-winded earlier. what chances of reform do you think there are to the Stability Growth Pact of 3% deficit and 60% debt to GP? And culturally, what chances of structural reform to the Eurozone, given the social costs in Spain and other Euro nations?
Good question. I'm not optimistic, to be honest. I mean, my impression is that there's been a suspension of the rules this year. The European, last year actually. The European Commission and the Council have allowed countries to suspend the application of the rules, but it's temporary. And as soon as the pandemic is over and maybe growth starts to, when we start to see some growth, I'm pretty sure we will see the European Commission insisting on a return to the rules, to the sound finance rules. As I said, I think it's a cultural battle. And unless we're capable of convincing a larger proportion of the population that we're currently convinced, the profession, the economist in Spain, the economist in Europe in general, I would say, are in favor of those rules, and I think they're in favor of sound finance. And I don't think it's going to change. I don't think there is enough. I mean, there's obviously a realization that all the horror stories that were told about the risk of incurring in debt and large deficits, the hyperinflation that would derive from those policies are not materializing. And I mean, I think it's evident that the mainstream narrative about the risk of high government deficits and debt is just not materializing, and it seems obvious. But the fact is that mainstream economists, even and of course politicians who are influenced by those mainstream economists, I don't think are going to change their. They didn't do it in the global financial crisis. It's been more than 10 years since that. I don't see it's going to happen again as a consequence of the pandemic. I think we need to have a cultural change. It's a cultural battle. And this is what we're doing from this association, our association in Spain, is try to get young people interested in MMT and hope that over time, that will spread the word. And because the current generation of economists, unless they retire or die away, I don't think it's, I don't think they're going to change their, we each time we've had any sort of discussion, in general, what we hear is all kinds of derogatory remarks about MMT. And in fact, I would say even aggressive, very aggressive attacks on MMT from mainstream economists when they pay attention. Most of the time, they're not paying attention. But when they do pay attention, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Weimar are their favorite trilogy when they analyze MMT.
Indeed.
And that doesn't go beyond that. So it's going to take a long time. And personally, I'm in favor of dropping out of the European Union altogether and the Eurozone. But I know I'm in a very fringe position in Spain. And it's, even Podemos initially played around with the idea of leaving the Euro. But that was in their early days. They've become more moderate as the years, and as they saw the opportunity of getting some degree of power and participating in the cabinet, and they've completely dropped all their radical ideas like 3 or 4 years ago. I've been in touch with a lot of the economists in Podemos who are supposedly progressive economists. They know about MMT. In fact, in the event where we founded the association, presented our association to society in Madrid in 2017, we invited a person who is now a member of this current cabinet, and he knows about MMT. but he's never going to speak up in favor of leaving the euro or in favor of MMT. So for us, approaching Podemos has been a disappointment. We tried initially in 2017, 2018. We approached Podemos. We have had discussions and meetings with. We've invited them to events, hoping that if they ever. And at the time, they were, of course, in the rise, and they were alarming the elites and the mainstream, but they were getting a large support, especially amongst the youth.
If I may, that actually leads to one of Wayne's questions. Wayne's had to leave, so we won't be asking any questions live.
Yep.
But basically, one of Wayne's questions, because he's asked the most, is what's the chance? Let me just find it. Pretty sure it's what's the chances of, say, Podemos being elected or another socialist party?
A progressive left party being elected.
Well, I mean, currently the government is a coalition of the Socialist Party, but those are not, I call them the secular conservatives because, because they are progressive on gender issues. And for example, they just passed last week a law on dignified death or euthanasia, right, which was approved last week. So they are progressive in some social issues and gender issues and identity issues. I mean, the gay marriage laws were approved in Spain. Was one of the first countries to approve a gay marriage laws under the previous socialist administration. But their economic policies are conservative. And Podemos is a member of this coalition, a junior partner, but they do not have any of the key positions in the economic governance. The only Podemos or minister with a key role is the Minister of Labor, Yolanda, who is trying to revert, but hasn't achieved that. The labor reforms that were introduced after Trichet wrote that infamous letter to Zapatero, the prime minister at the time in 2010, basically blackmailing the Spanish government into introducing those regressive anti-labor, pro-business reforms, right? They basically got rid of, a lot of the wage bargaining clauses in the Spanish labor legislation, etc. And she's been trying to revert that unsuccessfully because basically the socialist government is now controlling the key positions in finance and economy. And also I think they're using Next Generation EU as an excuse to say, look, and it's been fairly explicit in some of the statements that have been making in the last few weeks. They say, look, you're putting at risk gaining access to these funds. So it just shows you what the real purpose of those funds are. It's basically stopping. And then Podemos has been in the decline electorally for the last 2-3 years after I think they really believe they were going to be overcoming the Socialist Party, and they started to moderate their discourse or their narrative. And I think as a consequence, people just sort of lost faith in them. And now their expectation is less than probably 10% of the vote if we were to have a general election right now. The regional government of Madrid has called elections for next month, early May. And Pablo Iglesias, the leader of Podemos, resigned from the cabinet because he saw that they were going to lose parliamentary representation in Madrid, and he decided to give up. He decided to give up his position as vice president of the cabinet. And he's trying to basically save the furniture from the fire, right? That's what he's trying to do because the party is just losing support massively. And I think it's because people who voted for them expected more. They wanted real change, and it's just not happening. So somebody has mentioned Opus Dei there. So
it sounds like a global phenomenon to me, the technocrats versus the Democrats.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Just moving on to another question. We might go, if it's Gunther would like to ask his question live,
Mm-hmm.
Jane will be able to answer me.
No, he doesn't. So we'll
No.
just, yeah.
No, that's okay. I'll just ask the question straight out.
Yep.
I've reworded it a little bit. I hope it gets your intent there. Oops. Didn't Germany fail to respond to requests of the EU for structural reforms?
Mm-hmm.
That,
well, yeah, I mean, well, I think Germany has, Germany did the structural reforms before under Schroeder, another social democrat, the so-called Hartz reforms, which were proposed by this chap called Hartz. He was actually I think he was an executive of Volkswagen, and who had also been an investigation for corruption and so forth. But he was an advisor of Schroeder, and he proposed a set of reforms that basically ensured that Germany did in the process of internal devaluation. So in other words, keeping wages under control, and introduced the concept of mini job. So these very low wages, which are enforced and people are unemployed. And basically you either take the mini job or you lose your unemployment benefits. And these are jobs that pay maybe about 400 euros a month or so. And I think they get some supplementary income from the government so that you can survive, but barely survive. So Germany has been the champion of sound finance in Europe, and has led they've been the trailblazers for austerity policies in Europe. But the European Commission every now and then does some sort of a statement. Germany's trade surplus, which is their main major imbalance, and there's what we call in the European Union imbalance procedures. So if you don't meet certain targets, for example, your debt is too high, your deficit is too high, the European Commission will open an imbalance procedure and send warning letters, which could eventually lead to sanctions. Of course, those warning letters go mostly to countries like Spain. Germany, by the way, did not comply with the deficit rules for several years at the beginning of the Eurozone, around the year 2003 and 2004, but never really got much heat from the European Commission. But theoretically, the huge trade surplus of Germany, which is in excess of 8.5% of their GDP, is an imbalance. And theoretically, the European Commission should open an imbalance procedure and give Germany a warning about that. And they do send a letter, but Germany does nothing about it. There's nothing to basically force Germany to do something to stimulate its own demand, which would be, of course, helpful for the Eurozone if Germany had a more balanced trade surplus, or a smaller trade surplus. Southern European countries would have probably accumulated less debt with Germany. Basically, when you look at the debt of the Spanish government, it's largely driven by the legacy of the real estate bubble, which created a massive amount of debt in the private sector, which was reflected in a massive trade deficit. And when the private sector had to be bailed out, it was the Spanish government who bailed out the private sector through different mechanisms, either bank bailouts or trade or fiscal deficits for several years. In the end, all the private debt was basically dumped on the Spanish government. So now basically the Spanish government is in debt with German banks, indirectly through the central bank. The origin of that debt is the trade deficit that Spain has had with basically Northern European countries. And if those Northern European countries decided to increase their living standards of their population, and by increasing wages or introducing other stimulus of demand, or increase public investment, which, you know, it's become evident that Germany has a deteriorating public infrastructure, and there's been repeated evidence that German roads are in poor shape, that the health system also probably would need some improvement. There's a lot of evidence that Germany has been underinvesting in its public infrastructure for more than 2 decades, but they are, you know, obsessed with what they call the Schwarz Null, the zero, you know, black numbers. They want black numbers in their budget. Ironically, during the pandemic, Germany has been the country within the Eurozone that has been able to spend more in direct fiscal impulse. And the result will be that when the pandemic is over, maybe the German economy will recover sooner and will start to grow quickly, whereas countries like Spain and Italy will be left behind again. So it's the system in the end that I think just favors German mercantilism to the detriment of the German population. So, you know, it's very, I mean, we can't blame the German people because they are suffering the consequences of these policies. And we know that there's a large section of working poor in Germany, and that there's a large section of the German population that's been suffering the consequences of the Hartz reforms for more than 2 decades now, and or almost 2 decades. But the way I think the Germans elites are getting away with this is by convincing Germans that, oh, well, it's really because we have to help these lazy Southerners, you know, they get in trouble again and again, and we have to bail them out. And that means that the government cannot spend as much on you as they used to, because now, you know, your money is going to the Southern European nations. And it's very convenient because they're pointing the finger in the wrong direction. And the consequence is a rise in the Alternative for Deutschland extreme right party in Germany. And because, of course, there's a lot of insatisfaction in Germany as well, because the victims of the austerity policies and the Hartz reforms, you know, are not finding any sort of response in the Social Democrats. The German Social Democratic Party has been in the decline as well, electorally for I think it's on the verge of becoming the 3rd or 4th political party in Germany in the next elections, because they've been basically the champions of austerity in Germany. They were the ones who started applying preemptive austerity before they joined the euro.
Indirectly, that seems to lead a little bit to a question from Robert Hart.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want to imply there's a conspiracy, but
Mm-hmm.
do you see vested interests in the background that prefer the continuance of a neoliberal policy?
Absolutely, I do. Yeah, that's what it's all about. I mean, it's basically a reaction to the Keynesian policies of 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, we know that for a fact that the neoliberal program was basically begun in the 1940s under the Montpellieran Society, who were alarmed. These were people who were alarmed at the increasing role of the state, involvement of the state in the economy, and the improvement in the distribution of incomes that we saw after the Second World War in most advanced nations, even in Spain under the Franco regime. We could see that there was a growing involvement of the state in the economy, and also a larger share. I mean, the labor gained a larger share in the distribution of incomes in the 1960s and 70s. And neoliberalism was a reaction to the decline in the profit rates of private enterprises, of private corporations, and basically a strategy to to recover the the portion of the national income that is going to profits rather than labor. That's basically what neoliberalism has been about: getting the government out of the economy, deregulation, and in other words, making sure that it's the large corporations who control the decisions to invest, to spend, who gets employed, who doesn't get a job. It's giving power to large corporations, oligopolies, basically, because a lot of them are oligopolies or monopolies. I think it's quite evident.
How long do we have, Jane?
I think we could probably take or read Adam's question and then sort of start winding up, I think. But yeah, just so Adam's question on the
Yes, I've got it.
Yeah. Okay.
So Stuart, Adam's question is, won't the fiscal policy paradigm, I assume he's referring to the Eurozone, won't the fiscal policy paradigm change when there's increasing competition with China?
Well, well, it's interesting because, of course, the competition with China, with whom? With Germany, or with because
any
of course,
Eurozone nation. Yes, any.
Yeah, obviously there seems to be a growing obsession with China in the Eurozone. I agree, but so far I don't think Germany is experiencing. I mean, I'm not sure that they're competing in the same segments that the Germans specialize in. These sort of fancy, great motor vehicles or that the Germans manufacture, or the machinery the Germans manufacture. For the time being, I think China is not a real threat to German industry. I'm not sure it will be like that for maybe in 10 or 20 years from now. I'm sure China will be able to compete with German industry once their quality standards increase, and are increasing rapidly. And I think China has a plan. But it's a religion, it's dogma. Even if they see that we're losing, and I've seen it in the sector, the sector where I've worked for many years, which is biotechnology. I see we're losing ground versus China in biotechnology, and that the Chinese companies are becoming more innovative, more competitive, and that we're lagging behind. And I don't know. For example, I noticed that a friend of mine who has a laboratory and is doing PCR tests for COVID-19 is using a Chinese developed test, which is cheaper, faster. It doesn't require, extracting RNA before, which is what you typically have to do with most RNA tests. And he's selling this test very successfully, and it's a Chinese developed product. Chinese are now spending almost more than 3% of GDP in R&D. South Korea is even more, and Europe is lagging behind. And it's because the Chinese are making, the government is certainly planning and involved in economic planning and long-term strategies, growth strategies in the Chinese economy, and they're investing massively in their universities. They're investing massively in research centers, and I know this for a fact because I've worked with Chinese researchers in the past, and they have now excellent clinical research facilities. The Chinese know what they're doing. They have a plan to become the first economy, and they will surpass the United States, I'm sure, in no time. Even though we're seeing this and that we're losing ground versus the Chinese, Europe is still, I don't know, it's sleepwalking into its own demise and walking, and I don't know, I think in a generation, I think we'll be a developing country. Europe will be the developing part of the world And one day we'll wake up and say, well, when did this happen? When did we become a developing nation? We used to be the developed nations, and we're not any longer. I mean, I think it's just ideology and dogma. It's as simple as that, or as sad as that, I think, unfortunately.
Once again, it seems to be a worldwide trend.
Yeah.
Like, I'll bring it back to the next gen Europe and finish up with one question, once again from Wayne, because it applies to the upcoming next generation. Is MMT gaining acceptance amongst unions and local communities in Spain? How's that going through the next generation? Right.
Unions, not really. We tried to approach some unions in the past, and in general, I found that the economist again, the economists advising these unions tend to be fairly orthodox, to my surprise, and not very receptive, interestingly enough. Where I think we're finding more, we're getting more impact is among young people studying economics. We now have about 50 members in our association. I would say an overwhelming majority of those members are students of economics, or people who have recently finished their studies. And that's my only hope, is that young people will be the ones who will operate the change. That's going to be, I think, something that will eventually happen, but it will happen in 20 years from now. Or I don't know, I can't give you an estimate when the economics profession would change. But I think it's a battle of ideas, and you have to start with young people and students. Interestingly enough, and this is something that's puzzled me for a long time, it's very difficult to get women involved or interested. They seem to be more, we have some women in the association, but it's a lot harder to get them interested for some reason. And I think economics is a male-dominated profession. And it's something that we have to work on, but I don't know how to sort it out. It's something that we have, I guess, like one woman for every 10 male members in the association, which is a big issue. And why is that? It's hard to say. I think there is a perception that it's a profession for a male-dominated profession, and. But young people are certainly getting interested, and I think it's growing in Spain. And I also see a lot of interest in Latin America. We have some members of the association who are from the other side of the Atlantic, from Costa Rica, from Mexico, from Argentina, and I think it's young people who have questions, who are not satisfied with the mainstream narratives, they see that there's an incongruence between what they see in their real life and what the textbooks are telling them, and that's our hope as young people.
Hence the next generation.
The next generation.
The next generation. Well, this one we've lost. Yeah. We want to rescue the next one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just before I throw back to Jane, I just want to say that some of my favourite economists are women, starting with Eleanor Ostrom, of course, and Dana Meadows, and of course the MMT women, Stephanie Kelton and Pavlina Chernova. And I think Jane might be able to respond to your question about women and economics.
Yeah.
And with that, I'll thank everyone. Throw back.
Thank you, Darren. Excellent.
Thank you.
And Susan, would you like to make or ask any other questions before we wind up?
Yeah, I was interested in the fact that the next generation wants to reform pensions in Spain, and my impression was that certainly in the southern part of Spain, a lot of families with high unemployed and their members rely on the pensions of their mature
pensions. You're right. I mean, pensions have been a lifeline for many families. I mean, the grandparents' pensions has not only supported the grandparents, it's supported in many cases, especially in the worst of the crisis. It was the grandparents who were supporting their children, their unemployed children, and their grandchildren's children, their children's children. And pensions are not very high in Spain for most people anyhow. So I mean, so you can imagine this sort of situation that's been created for a lot of these retirees who normally should be enjoying their retirement incomes, right? And having to actually assist those children, especially in places that, I know you've been in Andalusia, and Andalusia has been a region that has especially been plagued with high unemployment for decades now. There has been an attempt by the Minister of Social Security, who is very conservative fiscally, to introduce reform in the sense of increasing the number of years that you have to contribute to the system and to calculate the pension. So now currently it's 25 years. The pension is calculated based on your income from the previous 25 years, and he wanted to increase it to 35 years, which was effectively a way of bringing pensions down, because a lot of people do not have records of 35, or will not have records of 35 years of contribution to the social security system, because unemployment has been so high for so many years. And so many of these young people today I've met people who have been, doing, research in laboratories as PhD students and chaining one temporary contract after another. And a few years ago, they weren't even required to contribute to the social security system. So you have people who are 35 and never contributed to the social security system. So if they retire in, say, 20 years time or 30 years time, maybe they won't have those 35 years that is required to get 100% of the pension. So we'll only get a portion or a fraction of what they would get under a system where it requires 25 years of contribution. This has been strongly resisted by the Podemos ministers, and that's been one of the battles, and the coalition is on the verge of breaking up. And one of the reasons it's on the verge of breaking up is the pension reform that Escrivá, the Minister of Social Security, wants to introduce, and has, I think, secretly suggested or proposed to the European Commission. And that's a political battle right now that's going on as we speak. And I think it largely depends on whether the cabinet breaks up or not, and what happens next.
Okay, so yeah, it was excellent. I
could go on for another 3 hours.
Yeah, I could go on for another 3 hours, and I'm really enjoying the conversation. It's just fantastic, but horrifying to hear. I just don't, it's hard to comprehend what people are living through, especially with the number of cases of COVID, and it must be just a sense of dread every day. And I wonder, if there's, in a psychological sense, in the conditions that you're living through, there's just no energy to have an uprising against what, or to make demands of what are, their rights to a job and to healthcare, and to, you would just imagine people are frozen in a sense of the constant threat that they're facing. No resources to deal with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fear. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think there was an uprising, so to say, in 2011. And the support for Podemos was, expression of that uprising. But then when people saw that Podemos was not going to be capable of transforming anything meaningful, other than some minor progressive reforms, but very minor, that really were not going to have a large impact. I think their voters just started, didn't show up in the voting stations anymore. And now that what we're seeing is, worryingly, is a rise in the extreme right, in Vox, this new far right party.
Mm.
And I don't think it's former voters of Podemos who are going to extreme right. It's just that the progressives are staying home when there is an election, and there is anger in society as well, anger in general, I think. And so this has just opened the field for an extreme right movement, and they're capturing this Vox party is capturing a larger share of the vote, and is almost on the verge of surpassing the Conservative Party. And you know, I think it's just a pendulum swinging. Went to the far left, so to say, just 4 years ago. That doesn't work. It just goes to the far right. That would not work either, because the problem is basically the fiscal system, the fiscal policies, and the types of policies that are being applied. But I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about the rise in support for far right parties, and it's general and throughout Europe. You see it in France with Le Pen, who is perhaps might be the next president of France after Macron leaves. You see it in Italy with Fratelli d'Italia possibly coming up in the next elections. Maybe there's a sorpasso, is the Italian word. You know, getting more votes than the Partito Democratico. You see it in Germany with Alternative for Deutschland. You see it in the Netherlands. All over Europe, you're seeing, because the Social Democrats just, you know, betrayed their electorates.
Yeah, they have.
This is what you're seeing all throughout Europe. Yeah.
So I guess in winding up, in the absence of a legitimate choice, like a legitimate progressive political choice, I mean, do you see someone stepping up from the MMT community in Spain? I just wonder how.
I think.
Yeah.
You know, I've been having discussions. So I know a party has been set up in Italy with Thomas Fassi and a guy called Paragone, and see how that works out. In Italy, I think there's been a lot more awareness of MMT and also a lot more Euroscepticism than in Spain. So maybe they're a bit more right for a political party. Here, we approached Podemos initially, and we didn't get any traction with Podemos. You know, they sort of listened politely and patted our backs, and that was all that we got, basically, not much else. Although we do have a lot of members of Podemos and Unidas. Well, it's actually a coalition of parties, actually. So Podemos is just one of the members of that coalition. So we do have several members of Podemos in our association, but we're not I don't think we have anyone who is visible enough. And that's you have a barrier which is, hard to break. With the media, and unless you manage to get someone who becomes visible and is outspoken in the media, I think it will be very hard, and eventually it will happen. I just don't know when and how, but I'm sure it will happen eventually. Once you get a critical mass of people who understand MMT and acquire that lens, I think it will eventually happen. We do have a member of our association who is the brother of a minister, Alberto Garzón. He's the Minister of Consumer Affairs, I guess. And Eduardo Garzón is an MMTer, and he has had some visibility in the media. But he's a very young person, and I think he's a bit overshadowed by his own brother. So I think, I don't know. Maybe him, but it will take time, and you need to build. I think the failure. Yeah, we tried to approach Podemos, and then we realized we just didn't have, the troops behind us, so to say. You need to have a critical mass before you really break out into the mainstream media. I think we need to have a long-term vision in this, and it will happen eventually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really applaud. It's hard work when you're working full time and through a crisis, like COVID crisis, with a family, to be doing this on top of what you're already committed to doing. So
Mhm. It is a lot of work, but I find a lot of satisfaction in it as well. Because
Yeah,
you learn so many things with, Mitchell in Australia, great guy, I think is fantastic. Randy Ray, Pavlina was in the foundation of our association. We had a huge event in Madrid with Pavlina Cherneva, and she's been in Spain on a couple of occasions and hosted her several times. Warren Musler is incredibly helpful. Every time you reach out to him, he responds and is always willing to give you a hand. So there's a wonderful MMT community out there, and it's a lot of resources, a lot of literature, a lot of research. Now we are doing research on our own as well. So we've been doing some work on a model for modeling what would happen if we had a job guarantee in Spain. I didn't have time to cover that in this presentation, but I think it's a growing community, and they're not going to stop us. I mean, it's going to take the mainstream strategy, their mainstream ploy is to ignore us or basically try to discredit us, but they're not going to stop us. It's just going to be a flood in a few years, I think, even in Spain. So it will take time, but we'll get there.
So, yeah. So we might say that, leave that as the final comment, I suppose, and move to just thank you and thank everyone for attending, and just to let everyone know that this will be available on our YouTube channel to watch. Potentially also will be made a podcast with Christian Riley and Patricia Pino. So look out for that. And yeah, we really look forward to talking to you again. And I hope that, it's very soon things start turning around in Spain, just slightly even better than what the situation is now, and that the COVID situation improves. So thank you very much. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Darren. You've disappeared, but thank you. All right.
I think it's still there. Thank you all for the invitation. Sorry about the hiccups, the disconnections, and the coughs, but I enjoyed the conversation and the discussion. It was very good.
Yeah.
Good work, and keep it up. I think Australia, you have the advantage of having Bill Mitchell there, so huge asset. And
yeah, he is.
I'm sure you'll
very supportive, and we do. Yeah, I think the media, I think it's growing in prominence here in Australia. We have some media, high-profile media types on board, but still a lot of resistance. So,
yeah.
All right. Thank you, and we'll see you again.
Okay. See you again. Bye.
Bye. Okay. See you.